Hello, and welcome to Stoicism Philosophy as a Way of Life. My name is Donald Robertson, and today's guest is Benny Vonkin. Benny is a Stoic, a life coach, and the founder of the Via Stoica website and podcast. He reached out to me saying he'd love to share his experience putting Stoic philosophy into practice because it greatly reduced his anxiety, worries, and helped him to deal with problems such as anger and frustration. So, hi, Benny, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Donald, and welcome. Thank you for having me on. It's such a pleasure to talking to you, and we've had this pleasure in the past, but now on the other side, and I'm just looking forward to having a good conversation.
Well, let's start with how you first became interested in Stoicism.
That's a great question. I bet you get it asked a lot as well, and a lot of these things happen with people when they're down on the lucks, when they have a difficult moment in life, and the same happened to me. I went through my marriage started breaking, falling apart, and ended up in divorce. I was having trouble with alcohol at that time. So that's usually when you need some guidance, when you need something to fall back on, and that's when I kind of rediscovered Stoicism, if you will, and found its practical application. I first made sure that I was getting back on tracks because I woke up one morning after going out on a heavy night of drinking, and I looked in the mirror and I said, "This is not going to be my life. This is not where I want to go. I wasn't happy where where I'm heading. So I figured I need something there, and that's where I rediscovered some kind of guidelines, some rules for myself,
Uh
and
huh.
found Stoicism along the way.
Do you know who you sound like?
No,
Still Paul.
still
Have you
Poe.
ever heard? Yeah, the Megarian philosopher.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. He was one of the people that Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, studied under originally when he was developing Stoicism. I don't know if you know this story, but he used to drink very heavily,
Hmm.
and he blew all his money on parties and heavy drinking and stuff like that. And one day he wandered in by accident into a lecture. Oh no, Polemon. Sorry, it's not still, but it's Polemon. He was a Platonist.
Hmm.
He was also one of the teachers of Zeno. Um, Polemon drank very heavily and wandered by accident into Plato's Academy, into a lecture by Xenocrates,
Hmm.
who was one of the successors of Plato. And he sat down and he I think he was drunk, right, and sat down and listened to this public lecture by the head of Plato's Academy at the time, and it had such a powerful effect on him that he quit drinking, and he ended up becoming the successor of Xenocrates as the head of the Platonic Academy, and he was one of the teachers of Zeno. So there you go. Like the origins of Stoicism, in part, are derived from a guy who had a similar experience to you.
Hmm.
Like he ran into problems with alcohol, and then reached a point where he thought, "I need to stop this." Like, and he embraced philosophy as a way of turning his life around.
Nice. Well, I'm not sure if I'm gonna make it all the way to the head of the of a philosophical
You can
school,
dream
but
big.
yeah, but exactly. No, but it did help me in that sense to overcome it completely. And I'm not sure if I would have learned that lessons while still being drunk if I would have walked in there, but especially that morning and just by reading that really helped me to find and I always talk about Epictetus being like kind of a verbal slap in the face that
Yeah.
I needed at that moment, and that really woke me up a lot to really take responsibility for my life.
And how long ago was this, roughly?
This is about six and a half years ago, and
Right.
I fully quit drinking about 4 years ago. Like
Mm.
after that moment happened, I'd never really went out really drinking again, but I had a few drinks here or there. But as you grow older and as you drink less and less, it starts to have more of a physical impact on you. So I would get headaches far faster, and I figured my time is far
Yeah.
more valuable than feeling bad.
Yeah. In Scotland, drinking alcohol is the national sport.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, quite deeply embedded in the culture. So it's something I was quite familiar with growing up. But then, how long was it before you started to get more involved in discussing Stoicism with other people? And how long before you set up the website and the podcast and so on?
That was fairly quick after that. First, I saw the practical application of Stoicism. When you start reading Marcus Aurelius, and there was some specific quotes that really struck me and that showed me directly at work to apply it. But once you start to read it, my head just started filling up with these ideas, and I had to write them off. I had to get them somewhere. And when I write for myself, it tends to go quite erratic. So I
Yeah.
figured if I put it online,
Right.
then it gets more, it's more structured, and I wanted to put it
Uh-huh.
more in a better, in a readable way. And one of the other
Yeah.
things that I really wanted to work on is dealing with
Mhm.
criticism. And where better to find criticism than to go online? And online, I know
Yeah.
from your Facebook groups that there's a lot of people out there who try to nitpick everything, and that really helped me to deal with the criticism, with the critique, but also to turn it into something as a learning method. I now look at when people criticize me, I ask myself, okay, are they right? Where am I wrong? What could I learn? Where are my gaps? And that's really helped me kind of evolve there as well.
I find like if you I have a background in training. I used to run a training school a long time ago. And actually, funnily enough, everything that I've done, like cognitive therapy, is based ultimately on what used to be called learning theory. And it's a skills based kind of quasi. So, cognitive therapy actually adopts a quasi educational model of therapy. And so we gather feedback. Every client that I see in therapy or coaching, at the end of the session, I ask them to rate the session out of 10 in terms of their satisfaction, and I get them to tell me what they're taking away from it, like what were the pros and cons of things that we did and so on. And in every training course that I've run, I get participants to fill out feedback forms. But also if you're a writer, you get these things called reviews of your books on Amazon, Goodreads, and your audiobooks and stuff like that. So I guess throughout life, I've kind of been inundated with feedback. And I had some involvement in research and e-learning where we gather a lot of feedback as well. I think I find the feedback that's you get for books and things like that, or stuff that you create, a bit more useful. Than the comments that people post on social media. Um, for some reason, I think often the discussions on social media can be I don't know. I don't feel like they're as informed sometimes. Like they can be. There's good ones and bad ones, but overall, I kind of think the feedback that you get from book reviews and things is like a lot bit more interesting. You have to learn. What always interested me is that there are actors and authors who say they never read any reviews, and they go, "The best advice I can give you is never read the reviews," and stuff like that. I always thought that was terrible advice, because we can learn a lot from feedback, and you just have to develop a thicker skin to be able to benefit from it, basically.
Yeah, and also that what Marcus Aurelius says, you choose whether it's going to harm you, and if you read it as words and as
Yeah,
something that is just an opinion from someone else, you can then choose, okay, what is really true about this? Is there some validity in what they're saying? Because that's where I really like, you have that Dunner Kruning effect where you start learning something, you're super confident about something, and then you
hmm,
start to continue, and you just realize how little you actually know. And that's what really happened there, where people pointed out things and gaps in my knowledge, and that really made me learn more about it. It helped. I at the beginning I would stay up all night and read stuff, and it's like, oh, where are they
yeah,
wrong? And at one point you kind of let that go. But I do agree, like, you have to face that critique. That's just the world we live in, and people have a different
yeah,
opinion, and that's great. And I think that that's also where what you see in these, with the different kinds of stoic streams that we have, where people tend to lock themselves in a little cage and are not able to review other insights on the philosophy. That's where you can go into a more dogmatic and maybe even dangerous stream of a philosophy
yeah,
and lose the philosophical aspect of
yeah.
the entire scene.
I definitely think there are people who talk about Stoicism, actually, about any subject, but in particular Stoicism. There are people who talk about it that I feel like I can tell they've not really engaged in much back and forth, like
Yeah.
dialectic or discussion about the things that they're saying, and that's in a way that's more like what the sophists did. They're just kind of like talking about Stoicism, but not really discussing it, and knocking the rough edges off of some of their ideas or learning how to defend some of the things that they're saying, spotting the weaknesses in their argument. You only really get that. That's why Socrates thought. One of the main things like we can take away from Socrates is that he took the Athenian youth from sitting listening to lectures or watching YouTube videos all day to actually engaging in dialectic with each other, like in a much more dynamic and interactive way. And I think that's really important to learning any type of philosophy, including Stoicism. But I was going to ask you, why do you feel Stoicism is still important today? You got some benefit from it yourself. Like what made it so valuable to you, and why do you think it's important to other people?
First of all, it spoke to me in a very direct way as I read more, especially Epictetus. It really like hit home. I think when people say this, I never knew I was a Stoic, but I've lived very much in the same way all my life. People call me very level-headed. So when I started reading about this, it just felt like me. So that's my personal experience with it. And when we've discussed this and when we talk about like the resurgence of Stoicism, sometimes I wonder whether it's actual Stoic philosophy that's making a resurgence or whether it's the label of Stoicism that people use to
Yeah,
give themselves some benefit. But I think it's the real relevancy now is, as we've seen, and you talked about this as well, about cognitive behavioral therapy. They knew something more about the human psyche. They knew what was
yeah,
ticking, because you can read the text, the ancient texts, and put them, change Rome to New York or wherever, and they
hmm,
still are valuable and they still are relevant. We are dealing with the same human
yeah,
condition and aspects that they dealt with then as well.
yeah. I've always said that I think the popularizing of Stoicism is overall a good thing. But in recent years, I've started to see more of some of the issues. I think it's become more problematic as it's become more popular. And one thing I'll note is that I've seen over the past 5 or 10 years, I've seen more people writing about Stoicism and talking about Stoicism who tell me that they have never read the Stoics, and to me, that should be kind of shocking. But there are a lot of people that don't think it's a big deal. So they get their knowledge of Stoicism from listening to podcasts or reading blog articles. They've never read Marcus Aurelius or Seneca or Epictetus, but they'll make videos and they'll talk about it and stuff. And so sometimes, because it's sort of third hand knowledge, then you get a very kind of diluted and sometimes such a distorted version of Stoicism that it drifts further and further away from what the original philosophy was like. And in some cases is the complete opposite. I'll give a specific example. Andrew Tate has a video where he talks about how he's influenced by Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism. And what he goes on to say about it, it doesn't give any indication that he's ever actually read the Stoics. He doesn't really refer to them. He talks more about his own ideas and labels them as Stoic. And the way that he describes dealing with emotions is quite contrary to what Stoicism actually teaches.
Yeah, like that is exactly that label that people use, right? They just say, "Oh, look at, I'm a Stoic," especially in
Yeah,
that masculinity scene. It feels like maybe even a shield. I feel like, and when we talk about someone like Andrew Tate, but it for me just oozes insecurity. When I hear people talk about Stoicism in that way, they're hiding, or they're trying to protect themselves from who they really are. And the Stoics really want to delve into who you are, right? They have that Socratic. They see Socrates as their one of their most inspirational people, and he's
yeah,
really keen on like, who are you? And that's the crux of it. And some of these things, like you've talked about Jordan Peterson with the 12 steps, there is some like I had a when I started dealing with my divorce and getting alcohol better grip, I made some rules for myself to get in shape, to better practice and be who I am. And to read more and eat healthier and get my physique in my behavior, right, get that better under control. But then it's that next step that I feel that a lot of people are forgetting, to really delve into something and to really go and figure out, why are these issues happening, what's going on here. And I think that that's something that people brush over. They want to have that quick fix, they want to have
right.
something that is instant that they can apply. But that's not what
Yeah,
Stoicism is about.
yeah. Even in cognitive therapy, which has a lot in common. So it's not the same thing as Stoicism, but has quite a lot in common with Stoicism and is to some extent inspired by it. The first step in cognitive therapy is usually what we call, in part, conceptualization or the formulation. Those are jargon terms that we use in clinical practice. And the conceptualization is when we take what research tells us about how emotions work and how the mind works, and we try and translate that into terms that the client will understand and that applies to their problem. The point being that clients don't understand certain things about how anxiety and anger and depression actually function. And it's by teaching them stuff that we've learned from research that we can give people a more informed understanding. Now, the ancient Stoics did that in their own way. The ancient Stoics had a theory of psychopathology that was based on a cognitive understanding of emotion. That one of the biggest problems is that when people talk about Stoicism today and they'll just try to take techniques from it, they usually don't understand what the Stoics took emotions to be. You need to kind of understand that for the Stoics, emotions are based on beliefs in order for the techniques to kind of make sense. Basically, like if you take the techniques out of that context, then they're different. Like they don't work in the same way. And when people don't read the Stoics or they're not interested in the philosophy, one of the main things that they miss, like, is this like innovative like understanding of how our mind works and how our emotions work. So that leads me on to the next question pretty neatly, which is, how do you see the value of Stoicism in relation to life coaching?
That's something that we've been like. I started as a life coach before, while I was doing my work on stoicism. This was all during COVID. I was a teacher before, and I feel like there's a lot of coaching elements as a teacher, because you're not just imparting knowledge, also
Yeah.
learning who the students are and how to do that the best way possible. And for me, there's a two-part look at that. As someone who practices stoicism in their life, I can apply it. I can be a better coach for the people who I work with, because I can be more objective. I really close that hour for that patient, for the client, just to pay my attention to them fully. And I
Mhm.
just use, so that helps me as a coach. And I can also look from the Stoic practices and how I've applied that to myself, to really evaluate what they might be saying, or where I need to go and ask questions. And something that I think is important, that I'm not here to turn people into Stoics. That's something that I've always said. I think a lot of people are out there. You got to do this. You've got to practice these things. You got to be more Stoic. But for me, something that we could really use is more philosophy of life in people's lives. That they start thinking about themselves. That they're asking themselves, whys, what are my priorities, what are my values. That's far more important. So when we apply that to Stoic coaching, it is first, it could be a little jump start and more knowledge about stoicism, where to start, what to read, how to really apply and delve into the philosophy, as you just expressed, in a deeper way, in a more profound way, and to see what it's actually about. But also to give those techniques and apply them in the right way, and to ask those questions of like, why is this important, and let's see how we can then manifest that. And also to turn the emotions, I see them as a great source of information. We often give that element of negative, right? Especially on the men, we can't talk about our emotions. But if we turn it into a source of information, why am I getting angry, instead of saying, oh, I'm angry, let me just use that as what Andrew Tate says, let me use that to go to the gym. There's so many things we can talk about there. But if we turn
Mhm.
anger into a source of information, and we can apply that pause to it, we can say, okay, let me just really evaluate what has happened here. Let me see what the trigger
Yeah.
was. That already takes a sting out of it. So that's kind of how Stoic coaching helps add something
Yeah.
more to life coaching in general.
Do you think anger can also be a source of misinformation?
Yeah, but that's how you but any kind of information can be
Yeah.
can be looked at from all different angles, right? So even misinformation can be information, but that's why having some support, or having a guide or a coach, could help you read that information in a better,
Yeah.
more objective way.
Well, that raises a good question. Why do people need a coach? Why can't they just do self help? I think that's a really interesting question. Let's right down to basics, right? Why? What does a coach add? What does a life coach add that people can't just do on their own, like by reading self improvement books and watching videos and stuff?
I think that's part of accountability. Like, you can read all the self-help books and even go all the coaching that you want, but if you don't do anything about it, then there's no real value in it. But what I've got a lot of the feedback is that I help people look at their own life from a different aspect, from a different angle,
Mhm.
just to give them that different view and ask questions that they might not have thought about. And maybe even they come with a certain issue or problem that they want to look into, and after a session they look at something completely different. So for me, it is really that just putting a mirror in front of them. And that's why it's also important as a coach to remove yourself from it. I've oftentimes have had like, oh, but why are they saying this is wrong? And I was like, no, this is their view, this is their opinion, this is their view of life. Let me challenge that. Let me ask those questions and see if we can find the truth of what's really going on. So if you can do it by yourself, I think there are people who can by reading the books and sitting there. And I've pretty much done that. I've had some people and friends and coaches that help me, but I'm sure that people can do it. But a lot of people want that extra guide and maybe some reassurance that someone can help them in that way.
Okay, here's a, let me ask you a more controversial question then that relates to the same point. We live in an era when people are inundated with self help and self improvement material. Okay, I'm old enough to remember when I was a kid, there were like a few self help books in the bookstore. Now there are many more, and the internet is absolutely awash with self improvement influencers. So we are consuming far, far more self improvement advice than we did, say, 30 years ago or so. But I don't think it's necessarily accompanied by tangible improvements among the people consuming it. It's certainly the level, the amount, the volume of self improvement content that people consume is disproportionate to the improvements that they seem to exhibit. Um, so, what I think there are problems with self help. I think there might be several. And, I wonder what they are. Like, there could be different ways of looking at it. Why don't people get more benefit from self help?
I think one of the things is the false promises that a lot of these self-help books project. Like, for example, the 12 rules of Jordan Peterson, which kind of implies that after these 12 rules, your life is going to be great. So we just have to apply these 12 rules and that's it. And there's so much more to it. And there's I think something kind of brewing in a society where people want to put the blame on other people, where they kind of lack taking responsibility for their own life. So if something doesn't work, then I'm going to go to the next book because this one didn't work.
Right.
And that's where that agency that people really tend to need to take on their own lives is
Yeah.
lacking, in my opinion, and where the
Right.
self-help book really lacks in the output.
Do you think it's possible that if people are trying to help themselves, like if their thinking is distorted and they have blind spots, that it's going to be difficult for them to identify the type of self help that they need? Um, you'd have to be thinking clearly and have self awareness and objectivity in order to know in the first place how to help yourself. That's one reason why I think that a coach like you adds something. You said you can bring an external perspective and hold a mirror up to people. People can't see themselves that clearly. We all have blind spots unless somebody else. You might be working with a client and help them to realize that they've got a problem with anger, for example. And I pick that because actually, many people that consume self-help today tend to focus on improving their self-discipline, improving their self-confidence, but they often neglect to work on their anger and interpersonal skills, and so sometimes you can see that they seem to actually be getting worse in that regard because they kind of have a blind spot for it and they don't know how to begin working on it. But a therapist or a coach can help them become more aware of issues that they previously overlooked.
And I think that's why the Socratic method is so important to be more reintroduced. It's crazy to see um, 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 how little the importance that gets in the world. We talk about Stoicism, but the Socratic method really implies you to look into who you are, right? And that's where that, because a lot of the self-help book, they scratch those superficial issues that people deal with, but they don't go deeper. And as you talked about, yeah, you have these blind spots, you have these things that you might not see yourself, and that's where an external person, a coach, maybe a family member or a mentor or someone like that can really help you. But if you really want to do that self-help, then you're going to do what Socrates did, right? He's going to go around and ask like, okay, what don't I know? Where's the lack of knowledge? What is the truth? And if you focus that on yourself, then you will start to reveal those
Yeah,
blind spots and those things, because you're getting input from externals. And I agree,
yeah.
that's where a coach and therapy, all those different aspects that we have right now, can really work together.
Do you think another problem with self help or self improvement advice might be that by its very nature, it tends to speak in generalizations to people? So, John Peterson would be a convenient example. It's probably the best selling self improvement book. He's like, here are 12 rules like that you can follow. And that kind of one size fits all
Hmm.
approach like might be problematic because people that are resilient are tended to we know from research are typically much more flexible and adaptive in their thinking. They don't usually just have like rigid rules and maxims that they follow. Like one of Jordan Peterson's rules is always speak the truth or at least never lie, right? That's good advice in some situations, but maybe not so much in other situations, right? And so I think resilience and wisdom would probably consist in being able to know when that's a good idea and when it's not a good idea. Like in the Socrates never gave formulaic advice like that. Like he encouraged people actually to spot the exceptions to their generalizations and to become much more dynamic and flexible in their thinking. So I don't know how you feel about that, but the impression I get is self improvement advice that you get online, by its very nature, it has to kind of speak in bullet points and generalizations. But that does overly simplify things, and it can lead people to follow rules, like sometimes in an overly simplistic and rigid manner. And commonly, we see that's exactly the problem that people are experiencing when they turn up for their initial session in therapy and coaching.
I always tend to look at it as like diets. We've been having like all these different varieties of diets all out there, fasting, keto, all of these things. And when I look at a self help book, it feels like this is a solution that someone found to make their own life better, and people tend, as you said, tend
Yeah,
to follow it blindly. And the same thing with
yeah,
diets, like this works for me, so you've got to go fast. But
yeah,
people forget that life is an exploration of to see what works for us. Experiment, try these rules, see how they
yeah,
work, where they fail, where they don't, and then try to adapt it to yourself. Because at the end
yeah,
of the day, these self-help books are just a guide of how one person helped their
yeah.
own lives, and that doesn't mean that it's going to help us necessarily.
Yeah. Cognitive therapy actively encourages a kind of experimental attitude like that. Try this and see and then modify it
Yeah.
rather than here's a rule to follow. And I think I absolutely agree with you. I think often what you get with self-help is people saying, hey, this worked for me, so I reckon you guys should do the same thing. And that often leads to this problem of overly rigid rules and overgeneralizations. Because what works for one person might not work for other people, or it might work sometimes, but not all of the time. So, with that in mind, what are some of the ways that you think Stoic ideas or techniques can help people in coaching? Like, in addition to using the Socratic method and getting them to evaluate things, there are also like tips and concepts and techniques we can derive from Stoicism. What sort of things do you think might be helpful?
For me personally, what I've seen with a lot of people is to apply
Yeah.
that pause. Is that just to give yourself a little moment of time? We always feel like we have to react immediately, especially
Mhm.
when we talk about something like anger. We feel like we have to react, instantly because some
Yeah.
injustice has done to us. And now that we have this emotion, now we know everything clear, right? From that distorted momentary insanity, as what Seneca says, we have to
Mhm.
now move from this directly instead of just allowing ourselves just a little bit of a break, just a little bit of a
Mhm.
pause to reflect. And Viktor Frankl says that, right? Between impulse and
Yeah.
action, there's that little moment of ourselves where we can gather ourselves. And I think that that's something that people tend to forget.
Yeah.
And for me, that's also a benefit of the coaching where I can give them that little pause, where I can ask them a question,
Yeah.
okay, but how are you feeling here? And that's where, again, as we talked about the self-help, that's where that exploration comes, where, okay,
Yeah.
how do I apply a pause? Maybe if you're angry, go to the gym, get that energy out, and
Yeah.
then see how you need to work away or see what's happening there, clear your mind a little bit. So that's one of the techniques that
Yeah.
I like.
How else do you think people outside of the consulting room can learn to introduce a pause?
Just by, for example, yeah, for going for a walk, or for me personally, it helps just taking a deep breath. But that comes with practice. Like that pause kind of gets smaller after you practice it more and more. And again, people want to have instant results there, and they say, "Oh, but this pause is going to take a long time for me." But you got to start practicing it, and that's something
Yeah.
that people tend to forget. One of the critiques on Stoicism is that it's look how perfect it all is, right? They describing the sage, But they forget that it's all about that journey of trying to get as close to that objective as you want instead of getting there already. And that's that impatience that people have.
How
So
do
I think
people know when to pause?
that's also experience and practice.
Uh-huh.
And I guess that's part of failing a few times, of looking back and of, oh, this is not the right action that I should have taken. Where did I go wrong? So
Right.
identifying those moments where you get that impulse and where you start to act. For example, when, and this might be exaggerated, but some people get angry, they punch a hole in the door, and it's like, wait a minute, that hole shouldn't be there. That wasn't good. Where did I go wrong? When did I? Maybe when I
Hmm.
started making a fist was the moment I started, or maybe when this happened. And as you start
Yeah.
to examine that, as we talked before, as you start to examine yourself and try to capture that information and remove that
Uh-huh.
disinformation, and then you can start to rebuild those steps and see, okay, maybe this is where I
Yes.
need to pause. Or
Right.
maybe once you start to recognize the trigger and you see that you
Yeah.
are, for example, in a supermarket. The other day I was in a supermarket and this old lady cut in line, and I saw it happening and I knew that was going to happen, and before I would have gotten frustrated by it, but now I was
Uh-huh.
already preparing myself, and I started just to kind of laugh at it, and
Right.
it's like, let her go. So I think that kind of is again the
Uh-huh.
journey where you start to recognize the steps in that process of
So
anger.
kind of
And
spotting things at an earlier stage, I think
yeah,
you're describing. Right.
yeah,
Right.
and then just realizing that, okay, maybe I shouldn't get in this situation at all, and then that
Uh-huh.
negative visualization, that mental preparation comes into mind. For example,
Hmm.
what Epictetus says when going to the baths, right? You know you're going to the baths and you're going to encounter all these people, so why
Yeah.
get angry at them? Your duty is to stay calm. And you can apply that to
Uh-huh.
driving. If you, before getting in a car, just imagine all the people you're going
Yes.
to meet.
Yeah. So if you know that you're entering into what you could call a high risk situation or a trigger
Hmm.
situation, you can prepare for it in advance. Like, so you're already going into it with a coping mindset, like, rather than allowing yourself to be very reactive to it. Are there any other things that you think we can derive from Stoicism, ideas or techniques that are particularly useful in life coaching?
What I've noticed is that a sense of gratitude building. Like we see that one quote from Epictetus where he says, when you kiss your child goodnight, whispers, tomorrow you could die. And that
Uh-huh.
sounds, obviously, that has a kind of morbid connotation, but it's really a
Uh-huh.
sense of knowing what things are
Yeah.
and being grateful while having them. There's a song in the Netherlands. I'll translate it in English, but it says, like, it's better to lose something than have never had it at all. And when you've had something and you've paid attention to it, as Simona Wells said, attention is love. Paying attention to something, pure
Yeah.
attention is real, like real love to show an appreciation for something. And once you can show people that everything that you have right now is you should be grateful for it, you should be able to use it.
Mm.
And okay, you might lose it at one point, but there's no need of living in fear right now. The same as about dying. Once you live in that constant fear of dying, you're going to forget to live right now.
Yeah.
So that's what I tend to help people with when they're coaching, to look at the
Uh-huh.
positive things and to be grateful for everything that you have,
Yeah.
and create that sense of acceptance there as well, to accept things that happen. And that's
Yeah.
difficult because that's something that you can't really tell people to oh, just accept everything that's happening is fine. But that's the next step.
I think this remark by Epictetus is jarring to a lot of people, that when you kiss your child good night, you should whisper to yourself that tomorrow they might die. But to his students, it wouldn't have been shocking at all,
No.
because it would have been a very familiar concept in Greek and Roman society. Similar ideas are attributed to much earlier philosophers, and were kind of pretty familiar. Like, so it wouldn't have been the first time they'd heard something like that. So they would have been much more willing to kind of accept it. Also, infant mortality was way higher,
Mhm.
like in the ancient world. Marcus Aurelius had 14 children, and 7 of them died before he did. Like, so the idea that you might potentially lose a child was like really much more familiar and commonplace in the ancient world. So in that regard, it's not as shocking as I think it seems to modern readers. The thing about gratitude is very prominent in modern therapy and in positive psychology, obviously. Marcus Aurelius says something really interesting about it. He says that normally we imagine the presence of things that are absent, and that evokes desire. Like, so I imagine how cool it would be to have a sports car, which I don't have. Like, that just makes me crave things that I don't have and experience a sense of privation. But Marcus says we should train ourselves to do the opposite and imagine the things, the absence of things that are actually present. So, I'm sitting inside at the moment with like central heating and air conditioning and stuff like that. There's a blizzard outside, So if I imagine what it would be like if we didn't have a roof on the building or electricity, it allows me to be more grateful for things that normally I'd take for granted. These are definitely things I think that can benefit people in modern coaching. Um, but specifically, one of the other things you mentioned to me previously was a very common problem in coaching psychotherapy is maybe everyone's favorite problem in a sense is how do you deal with worry and anxiety? And we live in an age of anxiety, because of politicians. Politicians love nothing more than anxiety. All right, the media love anxiety. They thrive on it. Like it's like catnip to them. Because when people are really anxious, they pay more attention to the media and to the politicians and stuff throughout history. Like that's been the case. So we live in an environment where people are trying to make us worried and anxious, and so there's a kind of endemic, like an epidemic. Sorry, there's a kind of epidemic of anxiety. What do you think Stoicism can teach us about coping with worry?
And I fully agree that just news and politics are based on fear. You see that I'm from the Netherlands. You can see that the politics are there all about fear and just
Yeah.
inputting specific items that they know that people, and they're not even as big as people think, but because you have one specific example and they help people feed on that. And for me, as a coach, I would focus on what really is happening in their life. You have that, putting it into grander perspective, zooming out, but also zooming in is important to see what is around you. Where can you influence you? What influence do you have, and where does your action lie? When I find myself worrying at night for big things in my life, or just lying awake with a specific thought, I ask myself, what can I do about it right now? And if you can do something about it, sometimes even if it's 3 at night, I just do it, because why? I'm not going to be able to sleep, so I might as well send that email or do that little thing, and I just relax, because I know I've done everything that I could have done. And that's something where in an action, what I feel from the Stoics, they say is, in action there doesn't lie a lot of worry. We worry about things in the future, things
Uh-huh.
that might have happened in the past, but it's always based on a future result of that we want or
Yeah.
desire, or something that we wish to avoid. But in a present moment, when you're doing something, there's not a lot of room for worrying. So sometimes I tell myself at night, now my action is to sleep, because if I want to do my job the best way possible, then I've got to be well rested. It doesn't always work as easy as just saying that, but the practice does help. So focusing on the moment, on the present, and on what you need to be doing right now, and doing that to the best capability of your skills and who you are, that really helps me to reduce your worries. And when we talk about politics, how much can you really influence about all these things? Just focus on the
Yeah.
life that you have and try to build that out as best as you can.
I think the dichotomy of control is really a useful concept in this regard. And maybe also the view from above is a Stoic practice that could be helpful, like picturing things. Well, actually, one of the things we know about anxiety is that when people are anxious, they narrow their field of attention down significantly and engage in more selective thinking. So they do what we call threat monitoring. They get really focused on possible signs of danger. And so the opposite of that would be to broaden your perspective spatially and chronologically, actually.
Hmm.
Like, so the Stoics recommend taking this broader perspective. That's directly contrary to what normally happens when we experience worry and anxiety. Um, but also focusing on the present moment, like you say, anxiety and fear, worry are very much future focused. And so you can't really engage in worry in the same way if your attention is grounded in the present moment. It's inherently antagonistic to it. One of the leading researchers on worry is a guy called Tom Borkovic, and he used to train people to focus their attention on the present moment because of this observation that you can't really worry while you're doing that. But Seneca knows that. Seneca talks quite explicitly about the same idea.
Yeah, and one other thing is also to try to prepare yourself for things that might. I'm the kind of person that if I go to an event, I look for the exits, and I say, okay, if something happened, I just do a quick mental exercise. If something happens, that's where I can go, and I say, okay, that's fine, and then I can enjoy the rest of it. And just that, those are small things that I kind of do, but to have that, if you project a worry, see what you can, what the steps might be, and how bad does it really happen, right? That's when you get that, putting it into broader perspective of the time and the place. But how bad does it really get? And even then, finding that confidence in yourself, maybe thinking back of all the other things that you've worried about and dealt with in a right way, creating that confidence in yourself that when that present moment comes, when it, and I've had so many times, I don't know if you've experienced this, but a lot of times when I'm worried about something, it never really happened. Right. It's like, and
Yeah,
now I tell myself, let me first see if this is actually going to happen. And when it does, I'll just concentrate and focus on my skills and my abilities at that moment to be able to deal with it in the right way. And
yeah.
that kind of helps as well.
There's research that shows that most of the things that people worry about don't happen. It's really easy to get a bunch of college students to keep a worry diary and
Yeah.
then review it at the end of the week and say, okay, write down all the things you worried about, and then at the end of the week, how many of them actually happened, or how many of them turned out the way that you were imagining that they would when you were worrying about them. Worrying by its very nature involves catastrophizing,
Mm.
like so usually exaggerates the severity and the probability, and also perhaps even more importantly, but a little bit more subtly, when people worry, they tend to underestimate their coping ability. Like, so they kind of imagine that if something bad happened, they wouldn't know what to do and they'd just be stuck. Whereas, in fact, they probably have a bunch of options. There's probably help that they could get to cope with things. Like they're not as helpless as they normally assume themselves to be. Um, there's something actually in the way that the psychology of worrying, the chronology of it is peculiar. We usually focus our attention on the worst point in time when we're worrying about an incident. People don't usually spend as much time visualizing what they would do after. Like how, so say something really bad happens, like you get fired from your job. Like the people who worry about it will kind of focus on the moment when they get fired and maybe the immediate aftermath, but they don't tend to think as much about the following weeks when they would be recovering from it and moving on. Like, so again, the Stoics want to, by getting us to broaden our chronological perspective, that helps to address some of those biases about our coping ability as well. But I wanted to kind of talk as well about my favorite subject, which we touched on a little bit already. What do you think the Stoics can teach us about coping with anger?
That's a controversial, and we have many conversations about anger. I don't know why so many people are so defensive when it comes to anger. When you tell people that being angry or anger is a dangerous emotion, people get, no, you can use anger. They get that kind of, become angry when you mention that.
Yeah.
And that's crazy for me because I don't know, I've never
Uh-huh.
had a lot of, it wasn't it so, I don't know, remember, I think it was Seneca who said like the worst plague in humanity has been anger, right? A lot of people, most people have died because people got angry or upset or from those emotions. And
Yeah.
when I look at him, when I look at anger from my non-academic mindset, I look at it as a fear that is based in insecurity and a sense of injustice, right? Something
Mhm.
has been done to me that kind of goes
Yeah.
opposed to my desires and my wants. And one of
Yeah.
my coping mechanisms is anger, is that frustration, is that
Yeah.
rage that
Yeah.
goes in me.
I
and
agree.
and that's where I feel like when we are grounded, when we apply that Socratic method of knowing who we are, when we are confident in ourselves, that can also reduce our worries because we know that we have the coping mechanisms to deal with what's happening. When we are confident about ourselves and we are fearful, then we can tap into that courage. Then we can say, okay, I'm fearful of this is going to happen, but I can deal with it. And anger is a lot of that insecurity where we just
Yeah.
trying to mask that and say, like, look at me, and show them I'm more powerful than you, and I can
Yeah.
deal with, I can. There was one person said, like, if you step into a meeting room, you should go in there with the attitude that you can kill everybody. Okay, great, but if there's
Right.
someone who doesn't mind that, then they still have a power over you, and you have a power. There's some fear based on that. So I think it's
Yeah.
it's it's a crazy way that we really value anger so much.
We think of anger usually as an emotion like fear or sadness, but actually, the way that you're describing it makes it sound like anger sound a little bit more like a coping strategy. That's something I'm quite interested in. So, I mean, I wonder, to what extent do you think anger is more like a coping strategy, perhaps, than some other emotions might be?
I think that that's a really valid point because you have grief. You can become angry because you are grieving. You can become angry because you're fearful or sad, or maybe even, I don't know, from joyful. But you can from those emotions, anger is an outlet. Anger is a manifestation of that emotion, because you can be, sad when you're grieving, but you can be angry for that loss that you've had. So
Hmm.
I do think it is. I think it would beg the different. It would be a great discussion to have whether anger is
Uh-huh.
actually an emotion, or whether it is a manifestation of that outlet of how to deal with that emotion.
Yeah, and in some ways it's more like a coping strategy. But that, as soon as you frame it that way, I think it changes some things. Because if we say it's a coping strategy, it kind of implies that it's a bit more voluntary, than people normally assume. Um, and also, it seems a little bit more ridiculous if we say it's a coping strategy, because it's not a very good coping strategy usually.
And the problem now is that, especially in the manosphere, um, in the manosphere, that people have started using that as a motivation driver. So people started to
Hmm.
tap into your motive. So they're actually promoting people
Yeah,
to be angry, and that's where we start to go into something dangerous, where
yeah,
you don't have any reason to be angry. They say, no, you've got to man up, get angry, and then you can press 500 pounds or whatever. But if that's your motivation to
right.
go to the gym, you've got a bigger problem. It's the same as people who quit alcohol
Uh-huh.
purely because of willpower. Willpower is like a
Uh-huh.
muscle, and at one point that muscle is going to flex, and you might fall back into drinking again. But if you do it out of an intrinsic motivation of saying this is
Yeah,
the best for me,
yeah,
if you do the same thing with the gym, if you go to the gym, I want to be physically fit because that helps me feel better at myself, but also to be more agile, flexible. You're going to also be more moderate in the gym. I've seen so many people go into the gym and maybe even using some chemical steroids because they want to look buff for whatever reason. Again, they have that exterior posturing that they want to make people think that they are stronger than they might be. But if you do that from the right motivation, you're going to do the right exercises. You're going to apply good nutrition with it. You're going to do everything far better, and you're going to have better results. But if anger is your motivation, if that's your drive, then you're not going to last long on that.
it's kind of surprising that people would advocate using anger as a, but
Yeah.
even though in a sense it's surprising, it's really common. Like something John Peterson, Andrew Tate, and a lot of these guys actually have that in common. In Peterson, I don't mean to pick on him, but he's just a very convenient example. He gets really angry in his in his videos. He's like literally modeling outrage and anger as well as kind of advocating for channeling it. Which is not a thing that we would ever do in cognitive therapy. You don't. It seems very odd. Like in cognitive therapy, we don't yell at the clients and model outrage to them. Kind of like encourage them to channel their anger into going to the gym and things like that. One of the problems with that is that both the Stoics and cognitive therapists share the same premise that anger is cognitive to a large extent. And so if your anger is not just a kind of blob of feeling, but it's, well, the way I like to explain it to people is clients come into therapy, they'll usually say, hey, I've got this problem with anger, anxiety, depression, whatever. And then they'll talk about how it's messing up their life, destroying their relationship, affecting their performance at work, damaging their health, impairing their sleep, affecting their concentration, blah, 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 blah. And so these are all reasons, motivations to change it. But then usually clients will express stuckness traditionally. They'll go, but I can't help it. Like, it's just the way I feel. I can't do anything about it. Right. And Ellis, the founder, one of the pioneers of cognitive therapy, used to lean forward at that point and say to them, yeah, but it's not just how you feel, is it? It's also how you think. Like you're having angry thoughts and you have angry beliefs as well as angry feelings, right? And some of those angry beliefs are irrational or they're highly selective or they're based on distortions or exaggerations or they're even contradictory, right? And by realizing that, you can start to change them and modify them. When you change your angry beliefs, then your emotions will change in step with that, basically, as hundreds of studies in cognitive therapy have demonstrated. But, these guys that say, hey, you should take your anger and go and channel it in the gym, I would ask, what does that do to change the underlying beliefs that made you prone to anger in the first place? How many uh, like bench presses do you have to do in order to modify the underlying belief that made you prone to anger.
And then how
I
many
don't think
bench
it has. Yeah, it has zero effect.
Yeah, and how many brushes do you need to do to get rid of that anger? Because then because if that's your outlet, if that's how you what you need to do, and I think that was interesting as you talked about it being a way of thinking. I always looked at myself as a victim, and I think a lot of people who are prone to feel that anger, and if you really want to sell, like if you want to really want to bring good stoic philosophy to the masses, it's not sexy, it's not something that but anger sells. Like that's why people like Jordan, that's why you get these viral clips of Jordan Peterson,
Yeah,
because he's out there yelling, and a lot of people who feel that victimhood, they
yeah.
feel
You
anger,
should
and
be angry.
yeah, and they
And you should
feel
be angry about cultural Marxists and radical feminists and all these
yeah.
other guys. You should be outraged. Like, you should be angry about the fact that other people aren't angry about it. Like,
Yeah,
that's kind of what they sound like, right? Yeah, they're like, definitely that's what they're trying to evoke. It's so out of keeping with what we would normally do in coaching or therapy. Um, but it's a weird amalgam of politics and
Mhm.
self improvement, which is always a surprising combination. Like, if there's two things that you'd think don't really combine well, like oil and water, it would be political rhetoric and self improvement.
Yeah, because they feed off that bringing it out there and showing you the worst sides of it all. Like as we
Yeah.
talked about at the beginning, the political rhetoric would bring out fear, and the self help will bring out the things. Again, we live in a society where it's so difficult to be seen and heard, and people feel irrelevant, especially if
Hmm.
you are lonely, stuck in a room, and you have no one to speak to, no one hears you in this vacuum of whatever. It's easier to go out and shout. You want to shout, you want to be heard, but again,
Yeah.
that's so again, that victimhood mentality plays a big part, and that's where that self-pity and the insecurity really feeds into all of that, and they feel
Yeah.
the injustice. And again, as you said, pointing to specific, feminism, women are the problem. No, no, look at yourself, point the finger to yourself, hold the mirror
Yeah.
in
You
front of
guys are
you,
the
and
problem.
yeah,
It's someone else that's causing the problem. It's not me.
yeah.
Like, you're to blame, right? Yeah, how can you do self improvement if you don't take any responsibility for your emotions? You just blame them on other people. It's so ironic because one of Peterson's things is about tidying your room and taking
Mm.
responsibility, but all of his rhetoric is about disowning responsibility and blaming other people for your anger and your problems. Like, there's a lot of externalization of blame, and the political rhetoric that comes into what he's saying is totally contrary to taking responsibility. Also, in order to take responsibility for your anger, you have to recognize that it's cognitive. You've got to recognize, your anger is caused by your way of thinking. Then you're taking more responsibility for it. But in Peterson's work and Tate and these other they don't recognize the role of cognition. Like, they don't tend to mention cognitive therapy. Like, they and how can you take ownership or responsibility if you don't even recognize what the thinking is that's causing your emotions? That locks you into disowning and externalizing. But Benny, I wanted to ask you a kind of follow up question based on that. Do you think that anger might be addictive?
That's an interesting one, and yeah, I do think so, because it's a very easy. I don't know the exact naming of all the hormones that it builds up, but it gives you a sense of power, right? It gives people a sense of,
Yeah,
I'm stronger than you, and I can kill you, and I can do something without you, and that gives people the endorphins to feel good about themselves in
yeah.
a certain way for a moment, and
Psychologists call it the illusion of control.
yeah,
Like,
and that
is
makes sense.
accompanies anger. Yeah, like, it makes you feel more in control of a situation than you actually are. Um, and there are a bunch of reasons why that happens cognitive. Maybe that's the addictive. There are several reasons, I think, why it's addictive, or kind of quasi addictive. I think that's one of them. Like, it creates an illusion of being more in control, and it does that actually by just limiting your ability to consider the consequences. Ironically,
Mm.
so anger kind of blinds you to the consequences of your actions. Right afterwards, when you've calmed down, you often regret being angry because you become more able to evaluate the negative consequences. But at the time, we it literally, anger inhibits our ability to picture the consequences of our actions, especially the longer term consequences, right? So that makes us feel more like it makes sense. because if I yell at my wife, and I'm incapable in that moment of picturing the fact that she might divorce me tomorrow as a result, I'll walk out the door. Like, I'm not thinking that far ahead, right? Because my brain has been switched off, like the emotion of anger taking over, hijacking my thinking. Right? It would seem obvious to an outsider, like, hey, dude, if you keep yelling at your wife, she's going to leave you. Like, seems kind of obvious, but I'm blind to that when I'm in a rage. I see the consequences. So it makes me feel more powerful than it makes me feel like I have more control than I actually do. Angry people are actually powerless. Because they can't even see that. Plato has a really good analogy for it. He said he compares being a tyrant, which is kind of we can say this is similar to anger. He says people believe that tyrants are very powerful. Angry people believe that they're very powerful, but tyrants don't really understand what's in their interest. Like, they think that being able to kill people and accumulate wealth is what really benefits them, but they don't really understand the goal of life. And so, if you don't understand what's in your own interest, how can you possibly be powerful? It would be like if I told you someone had a really sharp sword and they could use it to kill anybody that they want, but they're blindfolded, so they can't see who they're killing. Like, would you describe them as powerful? Like, if they can't, they're very dangerous, but they can't see the consequences of what they're doing. Anger is like a blindfolded swordsman. Like, it kind of makes us feel powerful because we've got this weapon in our hands, but we've got no idea what the consequences are, what we're doing, because we're blind to it. Like, when the red mist descends, we can't think straight. Like, so we're no more powerful than a blindfolded swordsman.
And then the one with the smallest dagger, who is smart and moves in the in the right ways, can easily catch up. And that
Yeah,
reminds me a little bit of that story of the sword of Damocles, where this was it
yeah,
Dionysus the tyrant who has everything, and Damocles says
yeah.
like, I want this as well, and he sits him on a throne, gives him everything, and hangs a sword above him. He said, now you see how great this is. And if you really have like, and that's why Marcus Aurelius is the best example of that, it is possible, right? That philosopher king, that if you do it the right way, you can actually make some changes. It's not going to be easy because he was still fighting off all the political things and everything. But a
Uh-huh.
tyrant, as you said, it is powerless because you are at the mercy if the mob, if everybody else joins together, then there's no one. If the fear ends, and I've seen this in with teachers who kind of use fear to instill the classroom
Yeah.
in a great
Oh,
fashionable
yeah.
order. But once the students lose their fear, then you're gone.
Uh-huh.
There's nothing there because that's the only thing that you derived your power from.
Angry people are stupid, gullible, and
Mhm.
easily manipulated.
Yeah.
That's why politicians love angry people. That's why politicians are surrounded by angry people, and like to provoke outrage, because when people are outraged, they're easily manipulated. Right? It makes them easily exploited. Muhammad Ali in the Rumble in the Jungle when he was fighting George Foreman thought, I can't beat this guy. He's huge. He's like a giant. But if I get him to lose his temper, like by taunting him, then he's going to exhaust himself early in the fight, right? Angry people. Do you think I think one of the paradoxes of anger? Angry people have this sense of strength, and I think that's part of what's going on in the manosphere. Is it appeals in particular to adolescent boys, appeals in particular to people that have problems forming relationships. They feel desperate, they feel depressed, they feel very vulnerable. But anger creates an illusion of empowerment and strength, right? But ironically, although angry people believe that they're strong and believe anger gives them strength, do you think that the opposite might be true? Is it possible that the angrier someone is, the more fragile and vulnerable they become?
And I think the more angry someone gets stems from an already insecure and vulnerable state of mind because
Yeah.
you want to embellish that to other people. Look how strong I am, and
Let me push you. When you get angrier, does that make you? Does that actually make you stronger, or does it make you weaker and more vulnerable? The angrier you become.
First of all, again, what we talked about, it removes that rational part of you, so that
Uh-huh.
makes you already more vulnerable of everything that else is happening. Because, as you said, you become more gullible,
Uh-huh.
so people can really push you into different directions faster. And I
Uh-huh.
think it does amplify all of those insecurities are being amplified there, and you just want to show that to the rest of the world. Like, look at how strong I am. It's yeah. I wouldn't even call it strength. It's just a manifestation of your weaknesses in a more
Yeah.
aggressive way.
Yeah. Like, I mean, angry people are like, they're blind. Like, they can't think
Mm.
clearly. They behave more impulsively. They underestimate the consequences of their actions. They engage more in selective thinking. One of the most interesting pieces of research on anger is that angry people tend to underestimate risk. Anxious people overestimate risk, right? So anxious people catastrophize, like they exaggerate the probability and severity of threat. Angry people tend to do the opposite and underestimate risk, right? And one of the main consequences of that is that they get themselves killed more easily. Like, but even worse, if you're friends with an angry person, like they'll get you killed too. Like, because by underestimating risk, they expose themselves and other people around them to danger.
Isn't that the story that you mentioned, and how to think like Socrates with Alcibiades, who at first thought he was doing all these risky things and showing courage, while then Socrates
Uh-huh.
said, "Is that real courage?" Or, courage isn't just doing risky
Yeah.
things; it's knowing what the right thing to do is, and
Uh-huh.
if it is dangerous, or if you are fearful, you still do it because you know it's the right thing to do, not just do. And this is again with the manosphere and all these things. No, you've got to take risk. You got to no, you have to make it calculated and apply all of your senses to really do the right thing, and then apply courage to it.
Yeah. Socrates says, "Is a madman who charges at the enemy courageous, or is he just reckless?"
Hmm.
Recklessness is the opposite of courage. Like, it's based on ignorance rather than knowledge or wisdom. Um, we don't think somebody's courageous. If somebody rushes into a burning house to save a child, we might think that's courageous of them. But if they rush into a burning house to uh, rescue uh, their collection of Pokemon cards or something, we wouldn't think that's courageous. We would just think stupid. We'd think it's reckless. Like, they've lost perspective. Like, that's also again what angry people are like. That their actions kind of don't make sense to external observers. And actually, angry people are experts on self-defeating
Hmm.
behavior. Like, the other thing that's, I think, worth emphasizing, one of the other paradoxes about anger, although angry people feel powerful, they tend to do things, they're experts at achieving the opposite of what they want. But you can only see that by kind of taking a step back. So angry people, for example, would want to kind of take more control over their relationship with their spouse, the girlfriend or boyfriend. But usually they just end up destroying their relationship and driving other people away, which is the opposite of what they want, right? So even though they feel very powerful, they tend to be more likely to achieve the complete opposite. Like, it's counterproductive. It tends to backfire. It's kind of obvious in a way, but that there's a complete lack of awareness of that when we're in the grip of anger, usually.
And that brings that question like, oh, and how about a little anger? Isn't that good
A
just
little
to
bit of
have a
anger.
little bit? And but
Yeah.
anger can be quite contagious. And as you said, if you are angry, it can spread out to a lot of people, and you could
Yeah.
endanger the people around you, the friends and family, and or whomever is with you. But even a little bit of anger can, maybe
Yeah.
you're a little bit angry, but then someone else can really have that sub fuel up. And I think anger is such a volatile
Yeah.
state of mind that it's
I
pretty
mean,
impossible to control.
what if I only underestimate risk and ignore the consequences of my actions a little bit? Surely that's okay.
Yeah.
Like, so it's when we understand anger more cognitively. What if I'm only a little bit in error? It doesn't make sense to say that. But I could channel my temporary madness and distorted thinking. No, like, that doesn't make sense. Like, if you understand it cognitively in terms of biases and stuff like that and errors of thinking, it doesn't make sense to say that you have a little bit of it, or you're trying to channel it in a positive direction, or you're venting it in the gym or whatever. None of that makes any sense. like if we're talking about mistakes that people are making or errors of judgment that they're involved in, maybe it could be useful. You could get things done politically. Like, anger could give you the motivation to kind of really, force change in society. It's one of the main justifications that people normally give for anger. But if anger distorts our thinking and makes us poor judges, having more perseverance, pursuing our goals more aggressively, like would seem like a terrible idea. Like, what sense does it make to say I'm going to sacrifice some of my intelligence, like in order to gain more motivation? That doesn't make any sense at all. Like, so you're going to do stupider things more aggressively. Like, it's not a trade off that makes any sense at all to me.
And then when you want to make changes, and if you want to make changes in the right way, doing it again from the right motivations would not require anger, right? Because you don't need
Yeah,
it. But if you, as we talked about in the beginning, a smart politician knows that if you create a mob, an angry mob, they will create the change that they want in a certain direction. So if you are
yeah,
part of that angry mob, you are just being pushed, you are being manipulated by someone who is using their wits, who is using their, they know exactly what they are doing when they are creating anger and fear in the people. And that's where we have to, again, we have to apply our own thinking, we have to question the things. And that's something that we forget to do when we are in an angry state, because we feel that what we are angry about is the right cause, and that's what I'm going to follow. And anyone who tells me something different, then I'm just going to be angry at them even more. And that's where we create that cognitive dissonance, right, where it's like, this is my belief and you try to question
yeah,
it. That's not going to happen.
yeah. It's difficult to listen to reason. Everyone knows, it's difficult to listen to reason when you're angry, um, because it's a deeply irrational statement. It's difficult to be objective, like when we're angry. There's a bunch of things that go on. One of the things that goes on in anger is a dramatic shift in our focus of attention. Like we tend to, when we're angry, with some exceptions, generally speaking, it throws all of our attention outward. Like, so it inherently makes us less reflective. Like, it's kind of, in some ways, it can sometimes function as a way of distracting ourselves from our own, like, weaknesses, fallibility. It's complete, in a sense, it's fundamentally antagonistic to self improvement to become very angry or very outraged, because it turns attention away. It's the opposite of know thyself, right? When we become angry, we tend to become deeply concerned with blaming other people, like, and all of our attention tends to be focused outwardly and shifted away from our own self and our own errors of thinking and our own character. And, we're not focused on the self, so we can't be doing self help or self improvement anymore. We think the problem lies with other people. We have to, famously, Epictetus said, somebody who's completely ignorant of philosophy blames other people for their problems, and somebody who's partially educated in philosophy or Stoicism blames himself. But somebody who's a sage and has completely assimilated Stoicism doesn't blame anybody.
Yeah, and that's kind of another thing that I think people forget about Stoicism, is where to put our values and priorities. And the Stoics, they say you have to guard your character and your soul. And if you do that, then if someone steals
Yeah,
something from you, you can get angry at them, but they are at fault. They have harmed their character. And if I act in the right way, if I accept it, right, then I can still preserve my humanity, and I can still preserve my right way of living, my calm state of mind. And that's where we can focus on our own actions and kind of separate it, again, that dichotomy of control from what someone else is doing. And we can remove that connectiveness between the action and my own state of mind. And I think that that's something where a lot of people forget about what really is important. We place the values in objects, money, and that's what we become angry about, the power that we lose, or some object that we lose. And that's where we place, again, our priorities. While if we place it in ourselves, then we can start to think about ourselves more, that internal work, as you said, that fear, that anger is more of an external expression of the emotion. But if we put it internal, then we start to examine things and become that observer. That's another great tool that I've used and seen with other people, is to start observing again, that view from above. But we start to observe what's really going on. It would be interesting to create an anger simulation where people would be able to look at themselves being angry. That would be an
Yeah,
interesting view of looking at it, and then see, how do you judge yourself, how do you look at yourself when being angry, and how do you think you are actually applying your cognizant skills to deal with the situation in the best way.
yeah. Plutarch thinks this is a recurring idea in ancient philosophy that people might literally benefit from looking in mirrors. Supposedly, Socrates used to tell his students to buy a mirror, like, and practice looking in it. Plutarch says that angry people should train themselves to look in the mirror so that they can actually observe their anger more objectively from an external point of view. Seneca, interestingly, talks about that technique, but he doesn't think that it's effective when somebody's really outraged. But Plutarch thinks that in some situations it can be helpful as a way of dealing with anger. I think a good place to conclude would be just to ask you what you think is the best way for people to begin learning about Stoicism and applying it in their life if they are completely new to the subject. Where should they begin?
What you mentioned, a certain stage of this conversation, is to read the ancient texts, to really go into those texts. And I've actually created a reading list for beginners on the website, where I connected the ancient texts. For example, you could read Marcus Aurelius and then read How to Think Like a Roman Emperor from your side, where you can get the ancient texts and you can get some perspective from yourself,
Mm-hmm.
but also to read Epictetus and read Massimo Pigliucci's How to Be a Stoic, or Seneca and Breakfast with Seneca. So you can combine those two books, where you can get more contemporary look and some techniques and some ways of applying it to your life. I think the application part is so important. So it also just identifying something that you want to work on, a part of your life. For example, anger. How do I deal with anger? How do the Stoics deal with it? The questions that we've been kind of asking, really focusing on one part and seeing how it applies to your life. So starting with the text, but also just speaking to other people, maybe a coach or maybe some other people. And there's so many great people I've met as I've started going on this journey of Stoicism. I met Bryce and Brendan, who I now founded via Stoica with. I met them on the Spaces, and people talk bad about social media, but it's what you put in is what you get out. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's the same thing with love. With life, if you put anger in, then you're going to get it back. But if you put honest, positive thinking, and you really want to improve yourself for the people around you, you're going to find those people who are willing to help you. So I think that those are great ways to start. But I do think that people should read the ancient texts and maybe find a guide if it's difficult for you to really understand and what the value is there. Find some other people who are just a little bit ahead of you, who can guide you a little bit through the lessons and see where you can apply it.
Well, I think that's been another great discussion about Stoicism. So thank you very much for joining me, Benny. We hope that you listeners enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. So please share the link with your friends and subscribe to the Stoicism Philosophy as a Way of Life newsletter on Substack for more podcasts and articles in philosophy and psychology. And thanks for listening. So it's goodbye from me, Donald Robertson, and from my guest, Benny Vonkin. Bye, everyone.